The carriage smelled of cold reeds and old leather, and Isolde of the salt marches sat with her hands in her lap and her hound at her feet working. The white dog's coat was thick with the small brown burrs of home, the kind that hooked into fur and skin and patience alike. And she pulled them out one by one with fingers that knew the work. Each burr came free with a tiny tug, a small private sound, and she did not throw them out the window. She tucked them into a soft linen pouch tied at her hip, the kind a marshwoman uses for herb cuttings and seed heads, and small mercies she has not yet decided how to spend. Outside, the spires of Highmoor were taking first light, white stone going pink at the tips, and the road was smoothing under the wheels, the way a road smooths when it has been built by people who can afford to build roads. The handmaid across from her, a thin girl named Mickey who had been assigned to her 3 towns ago and had not yet decided whether to like her, watched her hands and finally could not bear it. "My lady, why are you keeping them?" Isolde did not look up. She slid another burr free of Vesper's ear, the hound sighing through her nose without opening her milky eyes, and she folded the burr into the pouch with the others. "Because by tonight, I'll know which ones to give back." Mickey opened her mouth and then closed it, because that was not an answer for a handmaid to chase. Isolde let the silence be. She had not slept. She had a marsh cold ache under her breastbone, the kind she had carried since the treaty parchment was read aloud in her father's hall. An ache that felt like a held breath the body had forgotten it was holding. And she did not yet know that the ache had a name, or that the name was waiting for her behind one of those white doors. Vesper shifted, pressed her bony head against Isolde's knee, and Isolde laid one palm flat on the dog's skull and breathed once, slowly, all the way out. Highmoor came up on them like a held verdict. The carriage rolled through the lower gate, then the middle gate, then the inner gate, and at each gate the guards looked into the carriage and their faces did the same thing. They expected a princess and found a barefoot bog girl in a borrowed gown with a half-blind hound asleep on her feet. And they adjusted, and the adjusting was not kind. Isolde did not put her boots on. She had decided 2 leagues back that she would walk into Highmoor the way she had walked out of the salt marches, and if that cost her, it would cost her cleanly. The courtyard was already full when the carriage stopped. She saw it through the small window before Mickey could get the door. 3 tiers of pale stone, banners the color of bone, and people. So many people. All of them tilted forward with the soft hunger of a court that had been promised a spectacle. At the top of the stairs stood the prince. She knew him at once, and not at all. Calen of Highmoor was tall, the way a winter tree is tall, all line and no waist, and his coat was the deep gray that the diamond line was said to wear in their human shape, and his face was the face of a man who had been told for 7 years that the thing inside him was dead. He did not move when she stepped down. He watched her, and the marsh-cold ache under her breastbone did something it had never done before. It went still. Not warm, not bright. Still, the way a pond goes still when the wind drops, the way a held breath finally remembers itself. She put one bare foot on Highmoor stone, then the other, and Vesper jumped down after her and pressed her ribs against Isolde's calf, and a small ripple of laughter moved through the lower tiers because the bride had brought a pity pet. Isolde walked up the stairs without hurrying. At the top, the prince inclined his head, barely, the smallest possible courtesy, and his eyes went to the pouch at her hip for a single beat too long, the way a man's eyes go to a weapon he cannot quite name. "Lady Isolde." "Your Highness." She let her own voice be small and even, the voice she used for skittish horses and dying men. Behind him, on the right, stood a woman in pearl gray silk, with her hair the color of new wheat, and the woman was smiling, and the smile did not reach any other part of her face. Isolde marked her, the way she marked any plant she did not yet know was poison, and she did not smile back. The prince turned, and the court turned with him, and Isolde of the Salt Marches walked into Highmoor, with a half-blind hound at her heel and a small linen pouch of marsh burrs at her hip. And somewhere under her breastbone, the held breath waited. They put her in the West Wing, in rooms that had been a queen's once, and had not been a queen's in 2 generations, and they made sure she understood the distinction. The fire in the grate was small. The water in the basin was cold. The gown they laid out for the welcome feast was the color of river silt, which was almost certainly meant as a joke. Isolde looked at it for a long moment, then asked Mickey to fetch her a needle and a length of pale thread. And when Mickey came back, Isolde sat on the edge of the bed and put 3 small, even stitches at the hem where the seam had pulled, and put the gown on without comment. Vesper lay across the threshold, her one good eye half open, watching the corridor. By the time the bells rang for the feast, Isolde knew the names of the 4 people most likely to want her dead, and she had learned them by the simple method of listening at the unlatched servant's door while pretending to sleep. Lady Cassia of the Inner Court, who had been groomed since she was 9 to be the prince's chosen, and had spent a decade arranging her face into the shape of a future queen. Lord Garin, the Master of Arms, who had bet a small fortune on Cassia and did not like to lose money. The Dowager Counselor Phil, an old man with very clean fingernails, whose voice was the softest in any room, and who had buried 2 reformers and 1 princess in his long career, all by accident. And a young noble named Shawnee, who had grown up with Cassia and would do whatever Cassia asked because she had never been asked to think of doing anything else. 4 names. Isolde laid them down in her head the way she laid herbs out on a drying cloth, in order, by strength. The feast was a long, shallow performance. She sat on the prince's left, 2 seats down, which was a place chosen to insult without quite insulting, and Cassia sat on his right at the same distance, which was a place chosen to remind. The prince ate almost nothing. He drank water. He answered questions in clean, short sentences and asked none. Once, between the 3rd and 4th course, his hand brushed his own ribs as if checking for a wound that was not there, and Isolde, watching from the corner of her eye, felt the marsh-cold ache shift. Not still this time, but listening. Cassia leaned across the prince's plate to speak to her. "Lady Isolde, we were all so curious to meet you. The Salt Marches are, well, we hear so little. Tell us, is it true your people still bury the dead in the water?" The table did not stop exactly. It thinned. Isolde set her knife down. "We give them back to the water, yes." "How earthy." Cassia smiled. "And do the bodies come back up?" "Sometimes." Isolde lifted her cup, drank, set it down. "When they do, we listen to what they say." A small, uneasy laugh ran around 3 of the nearer seats. Cassia's smile got tighter at the corners. The prince did not look at either of them, but his knife paused over his plate, and stayed paused for a beat longer than necessary. And Isolde understood, with the part of her that read weather over the marsh, that he had heard every word and was choosing not to enter. That was a kind of message, too. She filed it. Later, when the dancing started and she was not asked, she walked out into the gallery with Vesper at her heel, and a small voice behind a pillar said, "Are you really a witch?" She turned. A child of perhaps 6 was sitting on the floor in a too large velvet doublet, eating a stolen pastry with both hands. He had Kaylin's gray eyes and someone else's freckles. "Who told you that?" "Aunt Kasia," he chewed. "She told my mama you put poison in the prince's cup at the welcome, and that's why he didn't dance." Isolde sat down on the floor across from him, because he was a child and the floor was the right height. "The prince didn't dance?" Because the prince doesn't dance. Look around. He hasn't danced all night. The child considered this with the gravity of a small judge. That's true. He tore his pastry in half and offered her the larger piece. Vesper sniffed at his shoe and decided he was acceptable. I'm Tomas. I'm not supposed to talk to you. Then we're both in trouble. She took the pastry. They ate in companionable silence for a moment, and then Tomas said, very quietly, She told my mama 3 days. She said, in 3 days, you'll be on the stones. Isolde did not chew. She did not look at him. She finished the pastry, brushed her fingers clean on the hem of her river silk gown, and reached into the linen pouch at her hip. She took out one burr. She turned it over in her fingers, the small barbed thing that had ridden all the way from the marsh in Vesper's coat, and she tucked it back away. Tomas, thank you for the pastry. You're welcome, he hesitated. Are you scared? She thought about that honestly. The marsh-cold ache under her breastbone had gone still again, very still, and she realized after a moment that it was because the prince had stepped into the far end of the gallery without her seeing, and was standing there in the half-dark, watching her sit on the floor with his nephew and her hound. He did not come closer. He did not speak. He just stood, and the ache inside her was a held breath that the body had finally remembered, and she did not yet know what to do with the remembering. A little, she told Thomas, but not as scared as she thinks. The first of the 3 days was a slow drowning in protocol. They woke her early. They dressed her in something the color of bruises. They walked her through the long gallery of dead queens, every portrait carefully positioned so that she could read in each painted face how she failed to measure. Lady Cassia walked her. That was the cruelty of it. Cassia in person, smiling, soft-voiced, naming each queen and each queen's accomplishment, naming the rare diamond line births and the lesser silver and gray lines, and the unbroken 600-year chain that had ended, by general agreement, the day the current prince had turned 18 and not shifted. We don't say it out loud anymore, Cassia murmured, her hand light at Isolde's elbow, the touch of a friend, the grip of a jailer. But the court has, you understand, made its peace. The Diamond Wolf is a children's story now. The prince is a good administrator. The treaty with your people was, in its way, generous. We bring in fresh blood from the borders. We move on. Isolde kept her face soft. He hasn't shifted in 7 years. Not once. Cassia's voice did not change pitch, but something underneath it did. Since the poisoning. You know about the poisoning? I know what was in the treaty letters. Marshcraft, Cassia said, gentle as rain. Salt marsh herbcraft, mixed into his wine at a council supper. He nearly died. The wolf went silent. Some say it died inside him. Some say it never existed. It's a very sad story, really. We've never found the hand that mixed the cup. It's the kind of thing that lingers in a court. Suspicion, old wounds. Anyone who comes from the salt marches now is, you must understand, walking into a great deal of old grief. She said all of it without a single barb visible in the words. Isolde could feel the burrs in her pouch shift against her hip as she walked. By midday, she had been introduced to 40 nobles, 12 counselors, and one extremely small dog belonging to the Dowager Queen Mother, who pronounced Isolde weathered and went back to sleep. By dusk, she had been allowed exactly 9 minutes alone, and she'd spent 8 of them sitting on the cold tile of an unused washing room with her face pressed into Vesper's neck, and one of them walking back out into the corridor with her face arranged. The prince did not seek her out. She passed him twice in the long halls. Both times he stopped. Both times he did not speak. Both times the marsh-cold ache under her breastbone went still. And both times he turned away first, jaw tight, hand twitching at his side, as if trying to ungrip something he had not yet picked up. On the second pass, near the armory door, he almost spoke. She saw the breath go in. She saw his throat work. She saw his eyes go to the pouch at her hip, and then to the hound at her heel, and then to her face. And his mouth opened, and someone called his name from the far end of the hall. Lord Garin, the master of arms, big and loud and on time. And the moment closed like a door. Isolde walked on. That night, alone in the Queen's rooms, she did 3 things. First, she unpicked the small, even stitches she had put in the river silk gown and restitched them, because the work calmed her hands, and she needed her hands calm. Second, she took every burr out of her linen pouch and laid them in a neat row across the windowsill in the moonlight, and she counted them, and there were 11. And she thought about the 11 faces she had memorized, and put each burr beside one of them in her head. Third, she sat on the floor with Vesper's head in her lap, and she said, quietly, "If we run, we don't run together. You're old. You can stay. They wouldn't hurt a dog." Vesper put one heavy paw on Isolde's wrist and did not lift it. The second day, Cassia made her mistake. It was a small one, and only Isolde noticed. They were in the herb garden. Cassia had arranged a tour, all the proper gardens of Highmoor, a slow march under cold sun, and Cassia paused over a low, silver-leafed plant and said, with great delicacy, "Of course you'd know this one. Marshweed. We grow it ornamentally, but in the marshes it's medicinal, I'm told. In larger doses, less so." She smiled. "Is it true you keep some on your person at all times?" Isolde looked at the plant. It was not marshweed. It was a common ornamental silverleaf, harmless as grass, and any marsh girl could tell the two apart blindfolded by smell. Cassia did not know the difference. Cassia had been told what to say and had memorized the line, which meant Cassia was being fed her script by someone who did know the difference and was deliberately feeding her a wrong plant to test whether Isolde would correct her in public. Isolde did not correct her. She let her face go a little vague, the way a girl's face goes when she is overwhelmed by foreign greenery. Yes, sometimes." Cash's smile widened a fraction. The trap had closed on air, and Cassia did not know it. But somewhere up in a high window, behind a curtain, Isolde felt the still place under her breastbone deepen, the way deep water deepens when something large drifts under it. And she knew without looking up that the prince had been watching the garden and had seen her not correct, and had understood the not correcting. That night, Tomas brought her a frog in a cup. "For Vesper," he explained. She looked sad. He sat on the rug while the hound investigated the frog with grave courtesy. Isolde let him stay until the bells rang for the prince's evening council, and she walked him to the door. And as he was leaving, he turned and put both hands very seriously on her sleeve. "If Aunt Cassia tells you to drink something tomorrow," he said, "don't." Then he ran. Isolde stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and watched him go. And behind her on the windowsill, the 11 burrs sat in their neat, moonlit row, and she went and picked up one of them, Cassia's, and tucked it into the inside seam of her sleeve, where her wrist would find it without looking. The third day did not look like the third day. It looked like a morning. They came for her with breakfast and a fresh gown and a string of small pearls that she was meant to understand as an apology for the river silt joke, and Mickey did her hair without speaking. Vesper sat by the door with her milky eyes fixed on the corridor and would not eat. Isolde noticed. She did not say anything about it. She drank her tea, ate half a piece of bread, and when Mickey tried to slide the pearls around her throat, Isolde lifted one hand and stopped her. Not today. Mickey's eyes flicked to hers, just once. And Isolde saw that Mickey knew. Maybe not all of it, maybe only the shape of it. But she knew enough that her hand shook as she set the pearls back down. And she would not meet Isolde's eyes again. The summons came at the third bell. Lord Garin came himself, with 6 men in council livery and a sealed parchment, and he did not bow. Lady Isolde of the Salt Marches, you are accused under ancient right of marshcraft poisoning against the person of the Crown Prince Kaelin of Highmoor, by hand and by intent, in concert with prior treason against the same person. Vesper rose from the door. Her hackles came up along her thin, old spine, and a low sound came out of her that Isolde had never heard her make, not in 9 years. Garin did not look at the dog. You are summoned to the execution stones to answer. There it was. The court had skipped the trial entirely. The accused, the law allowed, could be dragged in chains to the stones rather than walked. A final humiliation reserved for false mates, for traitors, for the kind of woman a court had already decided about. Isolde did not run. She did not weep. She set down her cup very carefully so it would not rattle, and she stood up, and she said, My hound stays here. Your hound comes, Garin said, by order. She understood then that Cassia had thought of everything. The chains were thin and bright. They wrapped her wrists, then her ankles, with a long span between, and the spans were short enough to make walking a small, humiliating shuffle and the dragging easier. They took her down the long gallery of dead queens, and the painted faces watched her go, and she did not look at any of them. At the great doors she stopped, just once, just long enough that Garin's man behind her had to put a hand at the small of her back and push. Vesper followed at her heel. The courtyard was full. All of Highmoor was full. The execution stone sat at the center of the lower court, 3 flat slabs in a triangle, dark with very old work, and around them, in a wide ring, stood the nobles in their best, and behind them stood the lesser court, and behind them stood the servants and the city, and on the high stair stood the council, and on the highest stair stood Cassia, in white, the way a bride stands. The prince was on the stair below her. He was not moving. He was not in armor. He was in plain gray, the way a man dresses when he intends to be present and not to be seen. And his hands hung empty at his sides, and his face was the face of a man who had been told 3 hours ago what was about to happen, and had been told also that he had no standing to stop it under ancient right, because the accusation named him as the victim, and the victim could not also be the judge. The Dowager Counselor Phil read the charges in his soft, clean voice. The charges were a fiction so well built that Isolde, listening, almost admired it. A second cup, a second dose. Salt marsh herbcraft sewn into the lining of her welcome gown, found this morning by a chambermaid. A small vial in the hem of a sleeve, not hers, but Cassia had been thorough, and the vial had been put there overnight by a hand Isolde could almost name. Witnesses, 3 of them, Shawnee among them, eyes red, lying very badly, and being believed anyway, because she was a noble girl, and Isolde was not. Phil finished. He folded the parchment. He said the ancient words. The guards stepped forward to take her to the stones. And here was the wrinkle Cassia had built the whole thing around. The small legal cruelty that turned a charge into a spectacle. Phil gave the order to drag, not to walk, and the guards did not lift Isolde. They did not steady her. They took the chain between her ankles in 2 pairs of gloved hands, and they pulled. Her legs went out from under her at once. She hit the stone of the courtyard on her hip and her shoulder, and the linen pouch at her hip burst its tie, and the burrs scattered, 11 of them, small dark spots rolling across pale stone in 11 directions. She heard Vesper bark, once, sharp. She heard Tomas, somewhere in the high gallery above, scream. A child scream, no words in it. She heard, very distantly, Kaelin of Highmoor say her name. Just her name. He did not move. He could not. Ancient right held him in place as surely as a chain. She felt her left leg break somewhere between the second and third pull, a clean snap below the knee that she heard more than felt at first, and then a moment later her right leg went at the thigh, a duller break, a deeper one, and she stopped being able to count what was breaking. The dragging took the long way to the stones, around the ring, past Cassia's stair, past the prince's, past Tomas hanging white-faced over the gallery rail with his mother's hands clamped over his shoulders. The crowd was making a sound, but not the sound Cassia had wanted. It was not approval. It was the low, uneasy hum of a court realizing that the show had tipped from spectacle into something it had not consented to watch. The marsh-cold ache under Isolde's breastbone, in all of it, was still, perfectly still. It had been still since the moment the chains went on, because Kaelin had been in the courtyard since before the chains, and the held breath of her body had finally, in the middle of this, remembered itself completely. The guards reached the stones. They flipped her onto her back. They laid her across the central stone the way you lay a deer across a stone, not roughly, not gently, just done. Her broken legs would not arrange themselves. They left them where they fell. Phil lifted the ceremonial blade. Cassia from the high stair did not smile. She did not need to. Her face had gone smooth and far away. The face of a woman watching a long plan finally close. Isolde turned her head, because her neck still worked, and she found Keelan's eyes across the ring. She held them. She thought, quite clearly, with the part of her that was not yet in shock, he doesn't know. He still doesn't know what's inside us. The blade came down. Phil was old. The cut was shallow. It opened her along the inside of her forearm from elbow to wrist, the way the ritual cut is supposed to open, a long red line, and her blood ran out across the dark old stone in a wide, bright spill that found the worn channels in the rock and ran along them like it had been waiting to. And the marsh-cold ache under her breastbone went still in a new way. Not the held breath still, the other one. The still before the storm breaks. It came out of her, not light, not flame, not the silver gold healing that the old songs promised every bloodline daughter. Something else. Something that had been folded up so small for so long inside two bodies that the courtyard could not, at first, see what it was. It rose from the stone where her blood had spilled, not from her chest, not from her hands, from the blood itself, from the place where her broken body had been laid down, and it gathered upward in a long, slow unfolding, and the unfolding was huge. The crowd went silent the way a forest goes silent before lightning. The thing standing over her on the execution stones was a wolf. It was a wolf the size of a war horse, the size of two, with a coat that did not look like fur. It looked like cut crystal in the noon sun, faceted, throwing prisms across pale stone, and the prisms moved when the wolf moved, slow rainbows sliding across the white faces of the court. Its eyes were the color of Kaelin's, and they were the color of Isolde's, and they were the color of neither, because they were both. The diamond wolf that the court had been told for 7 years was a children's story, stood with its forepaws braced on either side of Isolde's broken body and lowered its great head and breathed on her once, and her blood stopped running. Cassia made a sound on the high stair, a small, surprised animal sound, the kind a person makes when the trap they built does not, after all, hold the thing they thought they were trapping. Kaelin, on the stair below hers, fell to one knee, not in worship, in recognition. He had not moved during the dragging. He had not been allowed to. He moved now, and the movement was not a king's movement. It was a man's. A man whose body had remembered in one beat that something it had been mourning for 7 years had never died at all, and had not, it turned out, been his alone to mourn. His hand went to his own ribs, the gesture she had seen at the feast, and this time, when his hand pressed there, his head went down. Around the ring, the council was on its feet. Lord Garen's men had stepped back, all of them, from the stones, not toward the prince, not toward Cassia, just back, the way men step back from a fire that has just told them it is a fire. The wolf did not look at them. The wolf was looking at Isolde. It lowered its head again, and its great, cold crystal muzzle brushed her forehead. And Isolde, who had never in her life been afraid of an animal, was not afraid now. She knew, with the marsh cold place under her breastbone that had gone still and stayed still, that the wolf was not separate from her. It was not visiting. It was hers, as much as his. It had been waiting in the place between them, in the held breath of the bond, in the years of silence Kaelin had carried in his own ribs. And the silence had not been an absence. It had been a pregnancy. The wolf turned its head, slowly, and looked at Kaelin across the ring. He looked back. Something passed between them that the court could feel, even if the court could not name. The silent admission of two halves, recognizing the third thing they made together. Then the wolf looked at Cassia. The crowd went very still. Cassia did not move. She had not yet decided whether to be afraid, because Cassia had spent her life being told she would never need to be afraid, and the lesson would not unlearn itself in one moment. The wolf stepped down off the stones. It walked across the courtyard. The crowd parted for it without anyone giving an order. They parted because their bodies parted, the way bodies do for a force they cannot argue with. The wolf stopped at the foot of Cassia's stair. It did not climb. It looked up at her. And then, and the court would talk about this for the rest of their lives, would talk about it in 2 languages and 3 generations. The wolf opened its mouth, and instead of teeth, the court saw, for one heartbeat, the inside of a held breath. Cassia, who had stood on that stair her whole life waiting to be looked at, was looked at. And she broke. Not physically. Worse. She broke in front of everyone, in the small private way a face breaks when a person realizes the story they have been the heroine of has, all along, been the story of how they lost. Her knees did not buckle. Her hand went out, found no rail, found her own throat, stopped there. Her mouth opened. No sound came. The wolf turned away from her. It walked back across the courtyard, slow and unhurried, and it climbed the stones, and it lowered itself down over Isolde's broken body, the way a creature lowers itself over its young, careful, deliberate. And as it lay down, the crystal in its coat went soft, the prisms went still, and the wolf folded. There is no other word. It folded itself smaller and smaller until it was no longer a wolf at all, and what was left, lying half across Isolde and half across the stones, was nothing. The wolf had gone back into the place it lived, the place between them. Isolde was alone on the stones again. Her blood had stopped, but her legs were still broken. The cut along her arm had closed to a thin red line that would scar. Her breath came short. She was conscious, which was a small mercy and also a cruelty, because consciousness meant she had to feel her thigh, and her thigh was a country she did not want to visit. Kaelin reached her then. He had crossed the courtyard. She did not see him come. He was simply, suddenly, kneeling on the stones beside her, and his hands were on her face, and his hands were shaking. He did not speak. He did not try. He put his forehead against hers, and she felt the marsh-cold place under her breastbone go still and stay still, and she understood finally and completely what the stillness was. It was him. It had always been him. The held breath was the space between two bodies that had been built to be one shape, and the shape had finally, in the worst possible courtyard, on the worst possible morning, stood up. "Don't move me yet," she whispered. He did not. He stayed. Around them, the court was doing what courts do when reality rearranges itself, making small, useless sounds, looking at each other for permission, waiting for someone with authority to tell them what they had just seen. Phil, the dowager counselor, had not moved. He still held the ceremonial blade. His hand was white around it. He was looking at Kasia. Kasia was looking at the empty stones where the wolf had been. Lord Garin was looking at his men, and his men were looking at the ground. And somewhere up in the gallery, Thomas was crying without any sound at all. Vesper, the half-blind salt marsh hound, walked through the parted crowd as if she had not noticed it was parted. She came up the steps of the stones one at a time. She lay down against Isolde's uninjured side. She put her muzzle on Isolde's shoulder. She did not look at the prince. She did not need to. She had been the only living thing in the courtyard the whole time that had not flinched. They carried her up to the queen's rooms on a litter, and Kaelin walked beside the litter with one hand on the rail and one hand in hers, and he did not let go, even when the corridors were too narrow for him to walk straight. The court physician was already waiting. He was a thin old man named Brel, who had served 3 kings and had a hand tremor he hid well. And when he saw Isolde's legs, he stopped at the threshold and let out a long, careful breath, and then walked in and got to work. The marsh-cold place under her breastbone stayed still. Kaelin did not leave the room. Kasia was not arrested that hour, because Highmoor did not arrest its high nobility that quickly, even after a diamond wolf had walked through its courtyard. The council convened. Phil convened it. Phil, Isolde noted from the half-conscious country she was floating in, was very careful in the convening. Careful to speak of the events as wondrous. Careful to suggest that the question of the false charge could be set aside in the joy of the moment. Careful to fold his own hand out of view. Kaelin, when the message came, did not go down to the council. He sent back 2 words: adjourn. Wait. It was, Mickey said later when she came in with hot water and clean linen, and a face she had clearly been crying behind, the first absolute command anyone had heard the prince give in 7 years. The setting of the bones was bad. Isolde, who had grown up in a marsh village, where setting bones was a thing you sometimes had to do, at midnight, by lamplight, knew good setting when she saw it, and Brel was good. It was still bad. The thigh was the worst. It required 2 assistants and a length of clean linen between her teeth and Kaelin's hand on her forehead and his other hand crushed in hers. And when the bone went back into its line, Isolde made a sound that she did not recognize as her own, and Kaelin made a sound she had not known a man could make, and did not look at anyone for a long moment afterward. When it was over, she was wet through with sweat, and the room smelled of iron and clove, and the small herb fire Brel had lit in the brazier to clean the air. Brel splinted both legs. He bound the cut on her arm. He bowed to Kaelin, then to Isolde, then more deeply to Isolde, and he left. Mickey stayed. Vesper had not left. Tomas was somewhere outside the door, refusing to go to bed, and his mother had given up. Kaylin sat in the chair beside the bed and did not move. After a long time, Isolde said, into the firelight, "You didn't know." "No. Neither did I." "No." He turned her hand over in his. His thumb moved across her knuckles, slow, as if learning them. "Isolde." His voice was rough. "If I had known, I would have... I know." She did not let him finish, because she did not want him to have to find the words. The marsh-cold place under her breastbone was still, and the stillness now was not a held breath. It was the after of a held breath. It was rest. He pressed his forehead against the back of her hand. She felt him breathe out once, all the way down to the bottom of him, the way she had breathed out in the carriage 3 days ago at the lower gate. She thought, he has been holding his breath for 7 years. So have I. She slept after that for a long time. She woke into a gray afternoon. Vesper was on the foot of the bed, which was not allowed, and which no one had moved her from. Kaylin was at the window in shirt sleeves, looking down at the lower courtyard, and his shoulders were the shoulders of a man who had been awake for a great many hours. He turned when she stirred. He did not smile. He came to her. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took her hand again, as if he had only set it down to fetch water. "The council wants to bring Cassia before the stones." She considered the ceiling. She considered her own broken legs, which she could feel only as a kind of weight, a heavy presence at the far end of her body, which Brel said was the merciful work of the bond easing what it could without undoing the damage. She considered the 11 burrs, now lost across the courtyard stones, which had been a small private plan she had made in the carriage 3 days ago, to give a barb back to each person in Highmore who had earned one. She considered Cassia's face on the high stair when the wolf had looked up at her. "No," she said. He waited. "Not the stones," she said. "Not in chains, not dragged. Tell me what you want." She turned her head on the pillow. She met his eyes. "I want her walked." His jaw worked. Walked. Through the lower court, past every face that watched me dragged, past Tomas's gallery, past the herb garden where she pointed at Silverleaf and called it marshweed and didn't know the difference. Walked, on her own feet, by her own choice, in her own clothes, to the council chamber, where she will sit at the long table and listen, by name, to every charge against her, read out by the people she paid and the people she frightened. And then she will be asked, once, in front of the court, whether she wishes to answer. And if she does not, then she will be exiled to the outer marches in summer clothes, with 1 horse and no escort, and the gate will close behind her, and no one in Highmore will speak her name aloud again for 1 full year. After the year, anyone who wishes to may. Kaylin looked at her for a long moment. He said very quietly, "That is mercy." "It is not mercy," she said. "Mercy is what I show because I can stand. I cannot stand. This is what I do because I will not become her in order to answer her." His hand tightened on hers. "And Phil." She let out a small breath. "Phil is harder. Phil is the one who has been writing her lines. Phil is the one who told her Silverleaf was marshweed. Phil is the one who read the charges in that soft, clean voice." She closed her eyes. "Phil, I want to think about." "Take your time." "I will." She opened her eyes. "Kaylin." He looked at her. "When you stood on that stair," she said, "and could not move, He did not answer. "I need you to know," she said, "that I did not at any moment think you should have. The law held you. The law has held you for 7 years. I am not going to be the woman who teaches you that the way out of being held by the law is to break it the first time you have a reason." His eyes went very dark. He bowed his head over their joined hands. "Isolde," he said into her wrist. "Yes," she said, "I know." The court of Highmore learned over the following weeks what it meant to bow to a queen who could not stand. They learned it in stages. The first stage was the simple physical fact of her. Isolde could not be carried to the long council table because the long council table did not accommodate a litter, so the long council table was moved. They moved it into the south solar, which had high windows and a wide hearth, and a chair Brel had built specially with a long padded board for her legs. And the council came to her there, one at a time at first, and then in their proper number, and they sat at a smaller table than they were used to, and they read their reports in a softer light than they were used to, and they got used to it. Kaylin sat at her right, and Vesper lay across her feet, and no one ever asked the hound to move. The second stage was Cassia. Isolde's instruction was followed exactly. Cassia walked on her own feet in her own clothes, not the white, which she was not permitted, but a plain traveling gray she had to be given because her chambers had already been sealed. She walked the long route Isolde had named, past the lower courtyard, past the dark stones scrubbed pale but still discolored at the channels, past the herb garden, past Tomas's gallery, where Tomas stood with both small hands on the rail and watched her go by with an expression no child should have had to learn. Cassia did not look up at him. She walked into the council chamber, and she sat at the long table, and she listened. The witnesses had reorganized themselves. Shawnee, the noble girl who had lied very badly on the stones, lied no longer. She stood up and told the truth in a thin, steady voice that broke once and then steadied again. And when she sat down, she did not look at Cassia, and Cassia did not look at her. 3 chambermaids spoke about the planting of the vial. A young guard spoke about a coin he had been offered to look the other way. Lord Garin, who had bet money on Cassia, did not speak at all. Lord Garin had been quietly stripped of his command in the first 3 days, and was at that hour packing a single chest for a small house in the north, on Kaylin's order, made before Isolde had even decided what to do with him. Cassia was asked once whether she wished to answer. She did not. She rose. She walked back the same route, in the same plain gray, and at the outer gate she was given a horse and a small cloak that would be inadequate by the 3rd night, and the gate closed behind her, and Highmore did not speak her name. Isolde, when the gate closed, was in the south solar. She did not see it close. She felt the marsh-cold place under her breastbone go still, and then she felt Kaylin's hand find hers under the table, and she said nothing, and the council went on with its next item. The 3rd stage was Phil. Phil was harder, as she had said. Phil had not signed the charges. Phil had read them in his soft, clean voice, but the reading was a counselor's duty, and the writing had been Cassia's, and the proof of Phil's hand in the writing was thin as smoke. Isolde took a week with Phil. She had Brel sit with her through the worst of the pain in those days, because the bones were knitting, and the knitting itched in a way that would have driven a less patient woman mad. And while Brel mixed his poultices, Isolde wrote, slowly, in her own hand, a list of every soft, clean sentence Phil had ever said in her hearing. She matched them to dates. She matched the dates to letters Mickey, who had a sister in the kitchens, was able to find. Small notes, nothing damning on their own, between Phil's clerks and Cassia's maids, arranging small things. Suppers, seating, a vial. By the end of the week, Isolde had not a confession but a weather, a long, slow weather of a man's hand on a court. She brought it to the council with Kaelin at her right and Vesper at her feet, and she read it aloud herself. Phil sat through it with his hands folded and his fingernails very clean. When she was done, he inclined his head. "Lady Isolde," he said in the soft, clean voice, "I will not insult you with denial." She inclined her head back. "Thank you." He went to the outer marches, too. He went better dressed than Cassia, because he asked permission to bring a second cloak, and Isolde granted it because she had said she would not become Cassia in order to answer Cassia. And the second cloak was the smallest possible proof of that to herself. Phil did not come back either. The fourth stage, which took longer than any of the others, was the court learning her. The court did not learn her by being lectured. The court learned her by walking into the South Solar one at a time on small errands, and finding, each time, that the woman on the long chair did not rise, because she could not, and yet the room kept its shape around her. They learned her because Tomas was always there, sitting on the rug eating something he should not have been eating. And Tomas, it turned out, was telling them all about her in the casual, brutal way of children. They learned her because Mickey had stopped flinching. They learned her because the prince, who had not spoken above necessity in 7 years, spoke now in her presence with a low, warm voice that had gravel in it and laughter under it, and the court had not known either was there. They learned her because Vesper, who had once been a pity pet, walked the great halls now at the side of whoever needed her most that hour. The Dowager Queen Mother some days, Tomas most days, a kitchen girl with a bad knee on one notable afternoon. And Vesper's milky eyes, when she looked at a person, were the eyes of an animal who had stood by an execution stone and not flinched. And the court understood the citation. By the time Isolde was strong enough to be lifted into the chair, Brel had built her own wheels, a marvelous ungainly thing, 2 large wheels at the back, 1 small at the front, designed so that Kaelin could push her if he wished, or so that her own arms could turn the wheels if she wished. By the time she was lifted into it for the first time and rolled, slowly, the length of the South Solar, the court of Highmore had already, without quite admitting it, bowed. The wolf did not come back, not to either of them alone. They were both quiet about it for the first few weeks, because there was so much else to be quiet about. And then one evening when the fire was low, and Vesper was asleep, and Tomas had finally been dragged off to bed by his mother, Kaelin said, into the warm dim of the Queen's rooms, "It hasn't moved in me since the stones." Isolde was in the bed, propped on cushions, with her splinted legs out long in front of her. He was in the chair beside her, which he had not stopped sitting in at night, even when his own rooms went unused at the other end of the hall. She thought about it. "Nor in me." He looked at her. "You feel it. I feel where it lives. I don't feel it move." He nodded slowly. "I think—" He stopped. He started again. "I think it came out when it needed to come out. I think it came out because we were as far from each other as we have ever been, and as close to losing each other as we will ever be. And it was the only thing left in the room that could close the distance." He looked at his own hands. "I think it will not come again unless we are that far again, and I do not intend that we will be." She reached for his hand. He gave it. "Kaelin." "Yes." "I don't want it to come again." "No, not because I am ashamed of it." "No," he said, "I know that." "Because once," she said, "once was enough for the court. Twice would be theater." He huffed, very quietly. It was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard out of him since the Stones. "Yes," he said, "twice would be theater." Brel, in those weeks, was cautiously optimistic about the right leg and quietly grim about the left thigh. The right leg, he said, would knit clean. She would walk on it again. The left would knit also, but the bone had been driven, and the muscle around it had been torn in a way that did not heal back to what it had been, and there would be a limp, he believed, and there would be days when standing for long would not be possible. He told her this honestly, sitting on a low stool beside the bed, with his hand trimmer hidden in his sleeve, and Isolde listened, and when he was done, she said, "Thank you, bro," and he bowed, and that was the end of it. Kaylin, after Brel had gone, did not say any of the things she had braced for him to say. He did not tell her he was sorry. He did not tell her it would be all right. He did not promise to find another physician, or to import a healer, or to fly some northern witch down on a fast horse. He took off his boots, and he climbed onto the bed beside her, careful of the splints, careful of her, and he laid down on his side facing her, and he put one large hand over the top of her splinted thigh, just resting there, the lightest possible weight, and he said, "Tell me about the burrs." She blinked at him. "What?" "The burrs," he said, "in the carriage. I saw your hands. I saw the pouch. I saw you not correct Cassia in the herb garden. I have been waiting 3 weeks for you to feel well enough to tell me what the burrs were for. Tell me." She told him. She told him about the carriage and Mickey's question and her own quiet answer. She told him about counting 11 faces in her first 3 days and matching a burr to each. She told him she had been making, in her marsh girl way, a small private plan to give a barb back to every person in Highmore who had earned one. Not a curse, nothing like a curse, just the small ritual of returning a thing to the person it came from. She told him about Cassia's burr in the inside seam of her sleeve. She told him about Tomas and the pastry and the frog in a cup. She told him she had lost all 11 across the stones when the pouch burst, and she had not gone looking for them since, and she did not intend to. Kaylin listened with his hand resting on her thigh, and his eyes on her face. When she was done, he said, "If you had not lost them, which one would mine have been?" She looked at him. "You don't have one." "No?" "No, you were not on the list." His thumb moved, just barely, against the splint. "Why not?" "Because," she thought about how to say it, "because the marsh-cold place under my breastbone went still the first time I saw you. And I did not know what that was in the carriage, but I knew it was not the kind of thing you give a burr back for." His eyes closed. He let out a long breath, all the way down to the bottom of him, the way he had at the foot of the bed 3 weeks ago. He did not open his eyes again for a long time. The first time they were intimate, it was nothing like she had been told to fear. She had been told, all the long road from the salt marches, by older women in her father's hall, by the maids who packed her chests, by a great aunt who had been a treaty bride herself, what to expect of a noble wedding bed, and the powerful man, and the body that was not your own. None of it applied. They were already in the same bed by then, had been for weeks, sleeping side by side without touching the parts of each other that the older women had warned about. And one night, the touching became something else, and it was Isolde, not Kaylin, who turned her face up and asked, and Kaylin who paused, and asked back, and paused again, and asked the third time, and Isolde who laughed, actually laughed, a small surprised sound, and said, "Yes, yes, yes." He was careful of her legs. He was careful of all of her. He moved her, when she needed to be moved, with the slow, exact attention of a man who had been holding his breath for 7 years and had decided not to spend it carelessly. The marsh-cold place under her breastbone went still, and stayed still, and the stillness was not a held breath now. It was the after of one. They were interrupted, once, by Thomas at the door, who had come for a glass of water in the wrong wing of the castle and was extremely apologetic for an entire long minute before Kaelin, very gently, suggested he go ask his mother. They laughed about it for a long time after the door closed, and the laughing was, in its own way, what made the rest of the night what it became. The spring came on slowly. Isolde's right leg, as Brel had promised, knit clean, and by the time the first thaw had moved through the lower court, she could put weight on it for a slow, careful minute or two at a time, holding the back of a chair. The left, as he had also said, did not knit clean, and there would be a limp, and there were days when standing was not for her. On those days, the chair Brel had built her was waiting, and on those days, the court came to her, because by then, the court coming to her had stopped being a concession and become a habit, and habits in a court that old were the closest thing they had to law. The treaty with the salt marches was rewritten that spring. The original had been a one-sided document, a bride for a border, a daughter for a road, and Isolde, sitting at the long table in the South Solar with Vesper at her feet and Kaelin at her right, took it apart line by line over the course of 3 afternoons and put it back together the other way. The salt marches got the road and kept the bride. The border was redrawn at a generous fold that gave her father's people the deep water fishing they had been denied for 2 generations. The phrase treaty bride was struck from the document and replaced with Queen of Highmoor and the Salt Marches by bond. The Dowager Queen Mother, who had pronounced Isolde weathered at the welcome feast, and had not, since then, said anything else aloud to her, came to the South Solar on the afternoon the new treaty was sealed, sat in a chair across from her, looked at her for a long moment, and said, "You will do." Isolde inclined her head. "Thank you." The Dowager Queen Mother stood up again, with some effort, and walked out without another word, and Mickey said later that the Dowager had gone straight to her own rooms and ordered a small portrait commissioned, of a barefoot girl on the stones with a hound at her side, to hang in the long gallery of dead queens, between the second-to-last queen and the empty space where the last would have hung, if there had been one. Isolde did not learn about the portrait until it was already on the wall. She let it stay. Tomas turned 7 that spring. He had been in and out of her room so often by then that the maids had given up announcing him, and Vesper had given up rising to greet him, and Isolde had given up putting away the small carved figures of marsh birds she had been making for him on the long evenings, and they sat in a row on the windowsill, where her 11 burrs had once sat in moonlight. On the morning of his birthday, he came in with both small hands behind his back, and a look on his face Isolde recognized as the look of a boy who has decided. "And Isolde," he said. She set down her cup. The kitchen had taken to calling her aunt for the whole castle's benefit. He was the one who had started it. "Yes, Thomas. Uncle Kaelin says you can't marry someone in the chair." She glanced at Kaelin, who was at the window in shirt sleeves pretending not to listen and not doing a good job. "Uncle Kaelin said that, did he?" "He said it to my mama." Thomas frowned. "He said it would not be," he searched, "dignified for you to be married in the chair. So he's waiting for you to be able to stand for the whole thing, even just for the ceremony, even just for a few minutes." "That sounds like him." "But," said Thomas with great seriousness, "I think you should marry him in the chair, because the chair is part of you now, and if you marry him standing up, it's like you're leaving the chair out of it. And the chair was there. The chair was there the whole time." He paused. "Also, I want to push the chair down the aisle." The room was very quiet. Vesper sighed without opening her eyes. Kaelin, at the window, did not turn around. Isolde could see the back of his neck, and the back of his neck had gone a particular shade of red that she had learned in 3 months meant he was trying very hard not to make a sound she did not yet have a name for. She looked at Tomas. She looked at the back of Kaelin's neck. She looked at Vesper. she said. "Tomas, that is the best argument anyone has made to me about anything since I came to Highmore." Tomas beamed. He brought his hands out from behind his back. In them was a small, slightly squashed crown of woven river rushes, the kind Isolde had taught him to weave one afternoon when it was raining, and he was bored. He had clearly been working on it for days. "I made you a queen thing," he said. "It's a marsh queen thing, because you're a marsh queen, not just a Highmore one." She took the crown of rushes. She set it, very carefully, on her own head. It scratched. She did not move it. "How does it look?" "Crooked," said Tomas honestly. "Good," she said. Kaelin turned around at last. His eyes were wet, in the controlled way of a man who did not, by long habit, weep where he could be seen. And he did not pretend they were not. And he came over to the chair, and he crouched in front of her so they were eye to eye, and he said, "I have been very stupid about the chair." "Yes," she said. "I am sorry." "I know." "Will you marry me in the chair?" "Yes." He took her hand. He pressed his forehead against the back of her wrist, the same place he had pressed it the night of the stones, the marsh-cold place under her breastbone. She had used the phrase to herself twice since the stones, only twice, because some things did not survive being named too often. Went still in the way she now understood was simply the way her body told her he was in the room. She let it be still. They were married in the end, 3 weeks later, on a clear morning in the lower courtyard, on the same flagstones where she had been dragged. Isolde had insisted on the location, very gently, the way she insisted on most things now, without raising her voice and without giving an inch. The stones had been worn pale by 3 months of weather and 3 months of scrubbing, and someone, she did not ask who, had set small clay pots of river rushes around the edges of the triangle, so that the execution stones themselves had become, by the simple act of being surrounded by green, something else. The chair Brel had built her was pushed down the long open aisle by Tomas, with great dignity and only one small wobble at the halfway point. And Vesper walked at the left wheel the entire way, and the court of Highmore stood on either side and did not, this time, make any sound at all. The days after the wedding moved softly. The court adjusted, as the court had now grown used to adjusting, to a queen whose pace set the pace of the day. Mornings were slow. Isolde rose late, by Highmore standards, because her left leg ached worst in the first hour after sleep, and she had stopped pretending it didn't. Kaelin had stopped pretending he had urgent business in the early mornings, which had been a polite fiction they had both maintained for the first 2 months. Now he simply stayed. They had breakfast in the South Solar, and Vesper was given a small dish of broth on the rug, and Tomas, who came and went as he pleased, often arrived with a flower he had stolen from the head gardener, and a piece of news from the kitchens that was usually either entirely false or genuinely important, and never anything in between. Isolde walked, on the good days, with a carved stick Brel had made her from a length of marsh ash her father had sent up at the New Year. It had a knob at the top in the rough shape of a hound's head, and Tomas had named it Little Vesper. And Kaelin pretended this name was undignified for a queen's walking stick, which everyone understood meant he liked it. On those days, she could cross the South Solar on her own, slowly, and reach the window, and stand for a few minutes with one hand on the sill and look down into the herb garden, where the silver leaf was coming back in along the lower beds. She had pulled the silver leaf out herself in the autumn, with Brel's help, and replanted it on the far edge of the garden where no one would mistake it for anything else, and the new bed had taken. On the bad days, she stayed in the chair, and the chair stayed in the South Solar, and the work of the court came to her there. She had stopped feeling guilty about that around the time the chair stopped feeling like a defeat. One afternoon late in spring, when the sun was finally coming long across the floor and the smell of new earth was up through the open window, Isolde sat by the hearth with her splinted leg propped on the long board and the small linen pouch in her lap. It was a new pouch. Mickey had stitched it for her at midwinter, out of pale, undyed linen, and Isolde had begun, slowly, to put things in it. Not burrs this time. She had not picked up burrs since the carriage. The pouch held, by that afternoon, a small, smooth river stone Thomas had given her at the wedding, a curl of pale gold wool that had come off Vesper's coat on a brushing day, a dried sprig of silver leaf from the new bed, a folded scrap of paper on which Kaelin had once written, in his careful, clean hand, the 3 words, "I am here," and slid under her door on a night when she had not been able to sleep for the ache, and a tiny carved marsh bird Thomas had whittled for her birthday that was so badly carved you could not tell what it was, which she loved fiercely. She was turning the carved bird over in her fingers when Kaelin came in. He came in the way he came in now, without announcement, without ceremony, the way a man comes home to a room that is his. He had a smudge of ink on his jaw from the council chamber, and his sleeves were pushed back to the elbow, and he was, she noticed, faintly out of breath, as if he had walked too fast through the long gallery. "Brel," he said. "Brel. Brel says there's no reason we shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" "Try." She blinked at him. She had not been thinking about it in that hour. She had thought about it often enough in the previous months. They both had, in small, careful conversations on quiet evenings, the way people circle a hope they are not yet ready to set down between them. But in that particular hour, she had been thinking about the carved marsh bird and the smell of new earth, and whether the kitchens had remembered Tomas's preference for honey on his bread. "Try," she repeated, slowly. Yes. He sat down on the rug at her feet, because the chair beside her had Vesper in it, and Vesper had earned the chair. He put his elbows on his knees and looked up at her. "Brel says my recovery, and yours, and the bond, there is no reason. The body is the body. The bond does not, it does not require," he searched, "standing." She laughed. She had not laughed properly in a few days, and the laugh surprised her with how clean it came out. "Kaelin." "Yes?" "Were you waiting for Brel's permission?" "No." He considered. "Yes, a little." "And before Brel?" "Before Brel, I was waiting for you to ask me, the way you asked me the first time." She set the carved bird down in the pouch. She reached for him. He came up off the rug onto his knees, and his hand found her face, and she said, very quietly, against his palm, "I am asking." It happened, like most of what happened in those days, slowly. There was no rush in any of it. Kaelin had stopped rushing about anything in her presence months ago, and Isolde had never rushed about anything in her life. He moved her carefully. He moved himself carefully. The marsh-cold place under her breastbone went still, and stayed still. And Vesper, who had been on the chair, sighed once and removed herself to the corridor like a great aunt with standards. Afterward, she lay against his chest with the linen pouch still tied at her hip, and he laughed, really laughed, a low, surprised sound she had heard only a handful of times, and tugged the pouch loose from its tie and set it aside on the table and said, "You wear that to bed." "I wear it everywhere." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because the first one I made got broken on stone," she said, "and I wanted to be sure the next one didn't." He held her tighter. He did not answer. He didn't need to. They knew, after, before Brel did, before anyone did. Not from any sign, it was too early for signs, but from a quiet they did not name. The marsh-cold place under her breastbone went still, And then it did something else. It warmed, very faintly, the smallest possible degree. And the warmth was not the held breath warmth she had been told to dread the phrase of. And it was not the bond warmth she had been told for years to expect. And it was a new thing. And it was small. Isolde did not say anything about it for a long time. She wanted to be sure. Brel, weeks later, was sure. He came up to the South Solar with his hands folded in front of him, in the way she had learned meant good news and difficult news in the same breath. And he sat on his low stool and he said, "Lady, Your Majesty, there is a child." Kaelin, who had been at the window, did not turn. Isolde watched the back of his neck go a deep red, the same red as the day of Tomas's argument about the chair, and she said, "Brel, thank you. Please come back tomorrow." Brel, who had served 3 kings and now 1 queen, bowed and went away. Kaelin turned, finally. His eyes were wet again, in the controlled way, and not controlled enough. He came across the room. He knelt beside the chair, the way he had at the Stones, the way he had on the night of the carved rush crown, and he put his forehead against her belly, very lightly, as if afraid of his own weight. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was muffled into the cloth of her gown. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "When I was 18, he said, after the cup, after the wolf went silent, for a long time, for a very long time, I thought I had killed it. I thought I had been careless. I thought I had not been worthy. I thought it had been mine and I had lost it." She put her hand on the back of his head. He pressed harder against her. "I see now," he said, "that it had not been mine, not alone. It was waiting for—" He stopped. "For us," she said. "Yes. And now it is waiting again," she said, "for the small one." "I think so." She thought about that. She thought about it a long time. She thought about whether she wanted to know, ahead of time, whether the child inside her would be born under the diamond line, whether the wolf they had made together would stand up someday inside a third body, whether her son or her daughter would carry the cold crystal coat into a future court that, by then, she and Kaelin would have spent a lifetime preparing to be gentler than the one they had survived. She decided she did not want to know yet. She would learn it when she learned it. "Kaelin," she said. "Yes?" "Please get up off the floor." He laughed, into her gown, the second real laugh she had heard from him that month. He got up. He sat in the chair beside her, after picking Vesper up off it and setting Vesper carefully on his own lap, where Vesper consented to remain, because Vesper had decided in spring that the prince was acceptable and had been gracious about it ever since. They did not announce it for some weeks. Isolde wanted the small, private hold of it first, the held quiet of a thing not yet given to the court, and Kaelin, who had spent 7 years holding things in quiet, was glad to give her that. They told Tomas, who took the news with the gravity of a small judge, and immediately began drawing up a list, in his uneven hand, of things the baby would need, starting with a hound and ending with boots, small, too. They told Mickey, who cried into her apron and apologized and then cried again. They told Brel again, because Brel deserved to be told twice. They told the Dowager Queen Mother, who pronounced the news, as expected, and went back to her own portrait of the barefoot girl on the stones, which she had taken to having moved into her sitting room in the afternoons, for the light. They told Isolde's father, by letter, and the letter that came back was 3 lines long and ended with the sentence, "Bring her home in summer if you can." And Isolde set the letter in the linen pouch with the carved marsh bird and the river stone and the curl of pale gold wool. The afternoon I am going to leave them on came late, in a particular slow week of summer, when Isolde was past her 6th month and could not, on most days, stand for very long at all. The chair Brel had built her had been improved twice over the spring. Quieter wheels, a softer back, a small fold-out tray for tea, and on that afternoon she was in it, by the window of the south solar, with her splinted leg, which was no longer splinted, but still wrapped at the thigh for support, resting up on the long board. Vesper, who was older now than any of them quite wanted to say, was asleep at her feet with her milky eyes half open, the way she always slept, as if some watching part of her had never gone fully off duty since the day on the stones. Tomas, who was almost 8, was on the rug with a sheet of paper and a piece of charcoal, drawing the baby. He had been drawing the baby every week, in different scenes, getting steadily worse at proportion as his enthusiasm grew. Today's baby was riding a marsh bird. Mickey was at the table by the door, with a small basket of mending, working steadily, humming under her breath the marsh tune Isolde had taught her in winter. Kaylin had come in some minutes ago without saying anything, and was now standing behind Isolde's chair, with both his hands resting very lightly on her shoulders, looking out the same window at the same garden, and Isolde was holding the linen pouch in her lap with one hand and the carved marsh bird in the other, turning the bird slowly between her fingers. Outside, the herb garden was in full new green. The silver leaf was thick along the far edge, where no one would mistake it now. The river rushes were as tall as Tomas. There was a small clay pot of marsh mint that her father had sent up at midsummer, sitting on the sill of the open window, and the smell of it came in on the breeze and met the smell of Vesper's old, warm fur, and the smell of the charcoal on Tomas's paper, and the faint, clean smell of Kaylin's shirt under her cheek when she leaned her head back against his stomach. The marsh, cold place under her breastbone. The third and last time I will name it because some things do not survive being named more than 3 times. And a held breath that has finally been let out as one of them was still. It had been still for so long now that she had stopped noticing the stillness as a separate thing, and the stillness had folded into the room and become simply the shape of the days. Tomas finished his drawing. He held it up. "Aunt Isolde, look, the baby is riding a bird." "I see that," she said. "Is that all right?" "It's perfect." He went back to drawing. Mickey hummed. Vesper twitched a back paw, dreaming, and then settled. Kaylin's thumb moved very slightly against Isolde's collarbone, the way it had moved against her knuckles the night of the stones. Slow, deliberate, learning her again, the way he had decided once, and would, she understood now, decide every day for the rest of their lives. Isolde turned the carved marsh bird one more time between her fingers. She slid it back into the linen pouch with the river stone, and the curl of wool, and the dried silver leaf, and the folded scrap of paper that read, "I am here." She closed the pouch. She set it in her lap with her hand over it. Outside, in the lower courtyard, a bell rang for the changing of the gate watch. A soft sound. Vesper sneezed once, the small, wet sneeze of an old, half-blind hound, dreaming of something she had loved a long time ago. And Tomas, without looking up from his drawing, said, "Bless you, Vesper." Isolde smiled. Some endings are quiet like that. Until next time.